mind. So Isabel and I kept arguing who was going to present, you know, either on the African human rights system, or on this issue of colonialism's legacy. So in the end, we couldn't agree, so we did it in the most scientific way possible, which is we drew lots. Okay, so and I got the possibility to talk about colonialism's enduring legacy, which is the topic that I wanted to talk about after all. So I think I won, you know. In Corona times, I think this is a big win. Everything else sucks a little bit, but yeah. So I'm going to talk about colonialism and its relationship to some of the current challenges that we see on the continent. There's a way of talking about Africa that is prevalent in the mainstream media that is quite problematic because it repeats on the stereotypes that Africa has been portrayed as. And I think it's important to get a more nuanced understanding of Africa's trajectory, its potentials and possibilities. And to do this, it requires one to constantly challenge the information that is before us. Just because something has been repeated over and over, it doesn't make it the truth or the entire narrative. And in this talk, I'll try and show how many of the problems that Africa is grappling with actually are not the result of failure or mismanagement, but actually caused by being dealt a bad hand. You know, if you're playing poker and you get bad cards, there's not much that you can do. You know, you can try to do your best, and in a lot of places, this is essentially what people and governments are doing, making the best of what has been a really terrible hand. But the point is this, that when it comes to legal research, a lot of these stereotypical characterizations of Africa, but also its legal challenges, mirror what we see in the mainstream media. And as lawyers, as scholars interested in the law, it is really important to have this nuanced understanding of African states and the challenges that they have to meet. Is colonialism the answer to or the explainer for Africa's problems? I would say to a very significant extent, yes. It's possible to draw a straight line from the impact of colonialism to many of the legal problems that we see happening on the continent. And I'll try and explain why this is the case. Okay. All right, so I'm going to try and frame the contemporary realities of Africa by mirroring the things that we read, the things that we see, and try, as I do that, to also offer an alternative view about these particular matters. And then I'll look at what I think are the predeterminants of some of the legal political and economic processes and conditions that we see on the continent now. And then we will finalize this with a sharing of views by some African scholars on how we can engage in a decolonial study of Africa. By decolonial study of Africa, we mean the study of Africa that promotes an Africanist understanding of the continent's trajectory, uses African sources and understandings of the various social, political, and economic changes on the continent, rather than relying on Western-based perspectives that have developed out of colonialism. Okay, all right. Now, one way to describe Africa is to regard it as a place where there's chronic conflict, and many examples can be given, you know, incessant wars, people on the move, etc. This picture has got some truth to it, but at the same time, one can also consider Africa as a rapidly democratizing space. We see from the early 90s how many African states that were formerly dictatorships have adopted a number of very progressive constitutions that protect liberal values, protect human rights, and all of that. And we can give examples of this. And even in the midst of this chronic conflict, we see a picture emerging of countries gradually democratizing. Now, is this enough? The changes that are happening in terms of constitutional states and democratic states? Perhaps not enough. Perhaps it should be faster. But the idea that Africa is ravaged by chronic conflict, and that is also challenged by this reality. In the social arena, we see explanations that focus on the decline of social structure, often due to the lack of democratic space, economic opportunities. We see a lot of people moving. In Southern Africa, there's a lot of movement from the countries around South Africa to work in South Africa, other countries that are doing better economically. Within West Africa, it's the same. There's a lot of movement to Ghana and Ivory Coast because there's just not enough in the neighboring countries to support a growing young population. But at the same time, you look at how rapid urbanization is also offering opportunities for young people in places from the south all the way up to the north, and that incomes amongst this class actually is rising. The stories of countries like Rwanda, Botswana, Mauritius and others, where and Nigeria, where there's been the rapid adoption of technology and the development of tech industries and all of that. And it says a different narrative about this decline, and that new technology certainly offers new opportunities for particular categories of Africans. And then there's the issue of persistent legacy issues, on which I'm going to dwell rather a lot, because I think this context is missed in the narratives. In order to understand Africa, one has to understand these legacy issues, but you have to look for this information, because if you're educating yourself about Africa or legal issues in Africa, it is, unlikely that one goes back into legal history or the general history of a continent to understand this. And without this context, it is impossible to have a good frame of reference. Okay, so in terms of the political realities of what we have now, it's important to perhaps look back some 30 years and look at the types of governments that we had. 1991, we freeze the frame there and look at the kind of states we have. We have one-party states right across the continent. So after independence, a huge number of African states abandoned their new constitutions and instituted one-party rule where there was no political competition. Only one political party would be allowed to run and all of that. And it's only been 30 years since then. The wave of democratization happens in the early 90s, going through to the mid 90s, where democratic spaces opened up almost everywhere. And this is happening almost simultaneously. So the 90s were a heady time for many Africans in terms of the constitutional nature of their countries. 12 countries, military dictatorships, and we have a small number of multi-party democracies. But when you look at Egypt and Zimbabwe, yes, it's multi-party, but only in name. And then in Namibia and South Africa, you have a racist so-called democracy, if you are to abuse the name of democracy. And the impact of this is very obvious to see. If you look at South Africa or Namibia now, the legacy of this racist state is there to see. I mean, the inequality that South Africa has, the abuse that police authorities visit upon their own citizens and all of that. That legacy of violence, of a violent state, is still there. Okay, so yes, the fundamental basis of the state has changed, but this history of violence is built into the structure of the state. And so this violence of inequality is still there. It hasn't changed. And so when you start looking at how, for example, people who identify with the LGBTIQ communities are treated, you have to look back at that sort of violence. If you want to understand how foreigners treated with so much violence in this country, you have to look back to this particular history. Yes, the Constitution is beautiful, But this history has predetermined what is possible within the structure of the state, despite what one might consider as progressive laws. Okay, and when you go and look at these other countries where there's been brilliant constitutions adopted after multipartism in this list, I can just mention some, Chad, Central Africa, for example, Rwanda, and all of that. This history of one-partism is still present in the structure of the state. And again, this legacy is tied up with what I call the legacy of colonialism. And I'll explain this in a little while, okay? So another aspect that is highlighted when you talk about the continent is the matter of conflict, and that there's conflict everywhere. There was a great war between 2003 and 2013. The armies of 6 countries found themselves in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This wasn't widely reported, as happens with the death of thousands of Africans. But this was an atrocious war, 4 million casualties in 10 years. It's a huge number of people. Yes. And then we have in South Sudan, a new country that has been riven by conflict. In the Horn of Africa, you will have read the violence that's going on in Ethiopia, in Tigray, but also many other states of Ethiopia, Africa's oldest nation. Western Sahara is the conflict there that is not being resolved. Central African Republic, similarly, a lot of conflict there. So that is one explainer of the failure of the continent. But at the same time, there's been a resolution of long-standing conflicts, from Angola to Mozambique. The conflicts in Angola and Mozambique grew out of the decolonization fight, and the states, when they were established, never had a good basis for stopping the violence, and this continued well into the 90s. But this has been quelled. In Sierra Leone, we had quite Sierra Leone and Liberia, we had some atrocious civil wars going on, but this was resolved, and similarly in these other countries. So yes, there's a history of ongoing conflict, but at the same time, major conflicts have also been resolved. So for me, this indicates that the outlook should remain positive. It is actually positive because it means that many African polities are capable of resolving this host of issues. Okay. In relation to the social realities of the continent, a lot is made about the social dislocation of various communities. There's a lot of labor movement. We see this in Southern Africa, where in the 60s, the 70s, and into the 80s, a lot of young men would move to work in the mines in South Africa. but also places like Zambia. In West Africa, it has been the same. Currently, there's a lot of movement of young men from West Africa trying to make it to Europe. In the East, we see a lot of migration from places like Ethiopia, Kenya, and other places trying to get work in the Middle East. There's been rapid urbanization, a lot of rural folks moving into the cities. This is often unplanned. And then so when they move to these locations, there's minimal social services, health, education, housing, and sanitation. But at the same time, you can see how these polities are adapting to these massive changes. And we see innovation from young people trying to offer services across the whole spectrum, from health to education to food to whatever, trying to meet these particular services. Yes, there's a lot of people moving, but there's also a lot of innovation and trying to work within a state structure that doesn't yet have the capacity to support this amount of innovation, or the right amount of innovation for its current needs. And we have to frame this in relation to the imperatives of the post-colonial state, in that the focus has been principally on nation building and state legitimacy. And as you know, a lot of these states were just lines drawn on paper, many different ethnicities put together in a way that hadn't happened before. And so for the last 50 or 60 years, it's been trying to forge this idea of these places as unitary state and to maintain the legitimacy of that particular state in a way that wasn't, these states were brought together in a way that was not organic, as happened elsewhere. And so for the last 60 years or so, this has been the fight to do this. And nation building in a lot of places has sapped the energy from what the state could actually achieve and what it needs to do. And it has led to lack of focus on economic development and social development. And this is something that continues to hamstring African states. Okay. Marie, do I still have some time?
Maybe you can keep it short.
Okay, I'll try.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. So I want to quickly jump onto what I see as explainers of some of the many issues that we are looking at when we look, we talk about human rights or sustainable development, general legal development, and that. And there's this legacy of geography where it is clear that Africa has an unreliable climate, the soils are poor, and there's endemic and debilitating disease. At the same time, it's also one of the richest places on earth. I mean, if you look at the wealth of the DRC alone, the Democratic Republic of Congo, one then gets to see the scale of how much wealth there is on the continent. I mean, all of you have got phones or computers and all of that. These things would not be possible without resources from the mines in Congo. So one has to ask, okay, so what is going on, all right? Because Here you have countries that are endowed with some awesome resources, and yet they do not make it. Yes, geography and environment has not been kind, but at the same time, there's things that Africans ought to be benefiting from, but they don't benefit. We see the benefits being passed on to others who are benefiting from the exploitative nature of colonialism. So you look at the Congolese state as an example of the exploitation that continues right up to now, even after independence. Dan Gettler, who is Swiss, owns most of the rights to mining. The most lucrative mines are owned by this one person, and attempts to close down his operations are not possible because he's protected by Swiss laws and all of these things. And same with Benny Steinmetz and his operations in Guinea. And no one can touch him because the rules for banking, but also trading in Switzerland prevent that. I will talk about this in a little bit more detail, maybe in the Q&A. But the fact of the matter is this: that this is not the only story. Yes, there's problems with the location, with the geography, with the environment, with the climate, but there's also fantastic opportunities that often get missed. And the fact that Africans are not benefiting from the resources because of their relationships with people that are based in the north. It's people who are trading, sitting in places in Amsterdam, in London, etc., that are giving Africans the short end of the stick. And here people talk about accountability and all of that, and the people that they should be pointing their fingers towards are busy being wined and dined by those that have got power. Okay, all right, I move on. Slavery. Slavery is one of the most single events that put Africa on a bad footing. It basically emptied the continent. Millions upon millions of African folks were transported from their homes to places in North and South America. And over the past year or so, you've seen how this legacy of slavery continues to affect those Africans generations later that live in these places. But the impact on the African continent has also been great, because it meant that communities could not grow organically because of this constant removal of individuals. And up to now, many countries in Africa are still recovering from this dislocation. The loss of population and death and enforced transportation that happened caused immeasurable suffering, continues to affect many parts of the continent. And you must remember that it's not only this transatlantic slave trade that happened. There were other criminal enterprises operating across the Sahara, but also from East and Central Africa, going to the Middle East and that. No people in the world have had to endure this type of dislocation. Okay, now, in relation to colonialism, it is clear that colonialism has given Africans the state that they have. And in many cases, it is true that the current African state is just a mirror of the colonial state, because what colonialism did was to strengthen some powerful local leaders to the exclusion of others, because the colonial project was divide and rule. Many of these processes ended up undermining pre-existing checks and balances. And again, in order to make sure that the few colonial administrators could rule over millions, the institutionalization of repressive forms of government was the norm. You know, the colonial government had to be repressive by design. And these aspects of governance have been transported to the post-colonial state. In this presentation, Isabel had planned to talk about examples, you know, that come from criminal law, you know, what is criminalized, for example, in LGBTIQ rights, and that you look at the type of restrictions on freedom of assembly and all of these things. These were not designed by Africans. These colonial rulers trying to suppress the people, and then this has been bequeathed. It's been given to the post-colonial state, and to make this even more dire, the colonial state had no concern for providing services or defense, because it was just an extractive enterprise. This was meant to take away wealth from whatever place to London, to Portugal, and all of this. And we forget this, you know, say, but yeah, you are the architects of your own underdevelopment. And this comes from the Brits who went around the world transferring wealth from these places to London, so that now they can sit in judgment. Okay, so the challenge of the post-colonial government was that they inherited a state that had no effective infrastructure and economies that were designed for extraction. Even now, what happens mirrors that. I mean, look at the richest states that we have right across Africa. Nigeria, an oil-producing state that had its first refinery only a couple of years ago. It doesn't make sense. I mean, if you've got oil, you should be able to afford a refinery, but the nature of the extractive state could not allow this. DRC, Angola, name a country, Central African Republic. The state extracts, that's all it does, and doesn't have the capacity to create its own economy, create mass employment and all of that. And so in order to have political stability, you need a cohesive state, a state that relies on violence through law in order to control the inevitable dissatisfaction with the inability of the state to do what we expect of the state. And so this has meant either you come with us or we coerce you into submission. And this undermines what are the key tenets of a functional state, which is inclusion and accountability. But you can see this link to the colonial state. The African state has been fighting to to deal with the legacy of this up to now. And then my final slide, I just talk about this overdeveloped state, because it's a state that reaches out in the people's lives, maybe in a very extensive way, wants to know everything about what people do, overtaxes them and all of that. And yet, despite that capacity to spy, to know, to extract, is severely underdeveloped in its institutional capacity to meet what citizens need. So you have the same colonial structure holding back development. So I wanted to raise a number of these particular issues so that we understand where some of the limitations in the state come from. And I'll stop here, because I have spoken for too long, and perhaps we can tackle a couple more things in the Q&A. Okay.
Thank you so much for this insightful presentation. And I don't know, would you like to moderate the questions yourself, or should I assist?
I can moderate, I think. That should be
right.
Okay. Okay. Yes, Isabel?
Okay, I can start. Thank you. Thank you for giving this historical background. I would have a question on today's status. It might be a bit personal. I hope that's okay. So you talked about social realities, and we saw that we have a state that has a lot of colonial baggage for which it has to come up, kind of. So there must be development and change. And at the same time, we have a situation of a lot of brain drain, which you are a good example of. Could you state which measurements a state, according to you, would have to take to make it attractive to stay in the country, and then support and make up for the shortcomings at the moment? I can explain more, but I think that's the question.
Okay. This is a very challenging question, and answering it requires me to perhaps consider what I see as a daily personal challenge, and that is the possibility of or the extent of my contribution to my home. I didn't know it at the time, but I know now that what I received was a very colonial education. This is a problem that we have in many African states. We train our people not for our own countries. I fit into the British legal system so well, and I did not know it until I read a bit and started understanding these particular issues. So I trained as a lawyer in Malawi. I got admitted to the bar in Malawi, but everything about the education that I received was British, even though I was in Malawi. And to think that we have been doing that for 40 years after independence, it's quite depressing. But That's the thing about colonialism. These structures are there and they are designed to extract, but it's hard for people to know what's actually happening. There was a time in the 90s, there was a shortage of nurses and doctors in the National Health Service in England. And guess where they went to get their nurses and doctors? We lost so many doctors in Malawi, where the number of doctors was so few already. You know, our national medical school was not producing as many doctors, and they ended up moving to England, and so did the whole host of nurses and all of that. So the extraction is not limited just to natural resources, but human resources and people like myself. And this is because we haven't thought about our own systems and how to make those systems capture the people that we need for things to change. So to answer the latter part of your questions, what needs to be done for those that are outside already, like myself, we have to, on a personal level, try and make connections to whatever part of social development we can. I'm a teacher, so I make these connections with my university, my alma mater, making sure that I contribute in a substantial way to what is happening at my former law school and all of that. I don't want to bore you with the details, but it can be as big as you know, designing the assessment models for the School of Law, which we did in 2016, and we had a review in 2019 and all of that, and bringing the assessment models to an international standard and all that, or as simple as engaging in, you know, assessing of grades and that. Just this morning I received an email to mark some examinations in public international law and contracts at my alma mater. It's a small thing, doesn't change a lot, but it's my contribution to that. On a structural level, African states need to think about the purpose of the education system. You know, why are we conducting this training? Our development pathway is so different from the Western education models that we have been following. We need to train people who are going to provide the basic services of the state. We don't do this. Attending university in Malawi is the same as attending university in London or Birmingham. You know, we have departments that mirror universities in the UK. I don't think this is a good model. We need to go back and think, okay, so where do we want to end up in 20 years? And what does it mean for the skills that we need? And make sure that our universities do that. And I think once we start thinking in this way, instead of saying, okay, so we want a university, what kind of departments does a university have? And then you carbon copy others. We will end up with these problems where we train folks and they are more at ease at foreign places. I'm sure this is also the same for those that were in French colonial places and all of that. The importance of thinking about an African trajectory of development is really, really key in this. Personally, I always struggle with my place here in Europe. I think I have come to accept that I'll never be comfortable here. I'm always wanting to go back, but my kids are here with funny Essex accents, and now those accents being corrupted by some weird German accents and all of that. And so for them, this is their place. But for me, I accept that perhaps this will never be my home. And I think this constant quest to look for opportunities, to train PhDs from Africa, to teach with my colleagues, with my friends, like you saw PK in class today. EDC is a quest to make that connection, but there's need for change on a structural level. Africans need to own the state. They haven't owned the state for too long. We need to think about what we want in 30, 50 years, and look at the resources we have, the limitations we have, and try and address that without listening to all this advice that we get from the colonials, because that has taken us anywhere for the last 60 years. I mean, if these relationships that we have with the North were useful, we would not be in the place where we are now. Frida.
I have another question regarding a different matter. So this is concerning borders and territory, because in the period of independence, the OAU said that they want to keep the national borders and keep up the colonial borders and territories. However, we can see it now that borders and territory are still a very present issue. And I wanted to ask your perspective on that and how we can resolve that, or if there's a way to resolve that, because I think territorial claim and ethnic belonging is a strong issue regarding statehood and sovereignty, and I think that hinders the law of being implemented because people don't feel that they belong to the territory they're assigned to.
Yeah, okay, so right at the dawn of independence, a decision was made by the leaders of the liberation that we get the borders we get, okay. So the Organization of African Unity committed itself to maintaining colonial boundaries. In a large extent, this has held. There've been some disputes, some leading to terrible wars. You remember the Eritrea-Ethiopia border war, where close to 1 million people died fighting over some barren piece of land. This is a fight amongst brothers and sisters. We see this legacy still extracting lives, and when you go right across Africa, there's ongoing claims and counterclaims for territory. Tanzania and Malawi are fighting about where their border is in relation to Lake Malawi, which the Tanzanians incorrectly call Lake Nyasa. We in Malawi, we know it's Lake Malawi. I mean, it can be called anything else. Beyond that, in the DRC and Botswana and South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia, ongoing claims. And apart from the disputes on where the border lies, it's this issue that you have mentioned about belonging to the state, belongingness. And I have an idea about this. The African state was imperfect in its creation. I mean, people sat in Berlin and drew lines on a map. That's what happened. Clans and ethnic cleavages were disrupted because of this. But the African state, because it's been preoccupied with ensuring this centralization of authority, the idea of making the African state or creating this identity has not had a priority. In some states, we see a strong sense of identity. In some, not so much. There's still cleavage for the clan and all of that. Even in advanced governance areas like Kenya and all of that, clan and ethnicity plays a large role in the politics. There's need to focus on this as an urgent issue. Another aspect that could help resolve this is the forging of a very strong African identity. You know, the Organization of Africa Unity and its successor, the African Union, in my view, has failed to forge an African identity. You know, when we speak to African diplomats, you know, on the international stage, they talk about this idea of African brotherhood, okay? Yes, brotherhood, to describe the relationships that Africans have and all that. But when it comes to the important matters, there's no brotherhood existent at all. South Africa would rather sign an agreement with the European Union instead of waiting for a continental agreement with the European Union. That would give better terms to everyone on the continent. If Kenyans try to move to Tanzania for work or for business, the amount of warmth in this welcome is so little that one would be hard-pressed to describe it as warm. You know, despite the fact that the East African community has got laws that allow this free movement of labor, and so we need to see other Africans as Africans. We don't do this, and there are very simple things, you know, that we need to do. It's more likely for a young Zambian or a young Malawian to meet British or American young people than to meet people in the neighborhood. You know, there's no possibility, you know, to understand how the other Africans live, because if we did that, then this yearning for cleavage to our kin and kith in that state and all of that would no longer exist, because we would be, you know, a people that share, apart from our national identity, also share this African identity. You know, I'm really jealous of initiatives like the Erasmus and similar programs where young people get to see how important it is to have this idea of belongingness. I would like in my lifetime to see more of the same. I did not leave Malawi until I was 22. I'd never been outside, and yet all these countries were only a bus ride away. I could take a bus and go to Zambia or Zimbabwe or Mozambique. I never did, because this opportunity was not available to us. And I hope that for young people growing up in Malawi now or places there to get these opportunities. I'm sorry, this is a very long answer, Frida, but I have a series of thoughts about what needs to be done, and some of these are actually very simple things that the state already has capacity to do. Isabel, you had another question?
Yes, I wanted to make a conclusion question maybe, or to get back to us being scholars. Could you give us a short advice on how we should research, how we should write about Africa, especially when we are talking about African legal studies? So some of us are from African origin, some are not. Do you have some tips for us what to do, how to decolonize while doing research?
Yeah, I think as legal scholars or those interested in the law, we are actually in a good place, because I would like to believe that what legal training does is to allow us the space to be more critical, you know, when we are looking at situations, to have this ability to look at an issue from multiple angles. My advice is that when you read, always have that little bit of skepticism about statements that seem definite. You know, find out what is the context, what happened, you know, and I'll give examples about this particular way of reading, and some of it relates to my presentation this morning. If someone says, okay, so in Uganda there is extensive restriction of LGBTIQ rights. Okay, now this statement is true. Okay, ask yourselves, okay, so why is this the case? When you look at the reasons for it, you can either accept that, yes, the laws are really bad. That is true. The institutions bent on enforcing these laws, so they are part of the problem. That also is true. But when you look at these laws, they were given to Uganda by the British. The same people that are now rising up and say, but you look at your laws are really crap. You know, the same people did that. This is true. Look at who is funding the churches that are spreading hate. Who is funding them? And you find out that major evangelical churches in the US and the UK are pumping millions into Uganda to spread their hateful ideologies. Then you now know who is responsible for this. You know, they don't do this in very open and transparent ways, but this is their agenda. And they're not just doing this in Uganda, they're doing this everywhere. In order to understand this, it means you have to be skeptical and refuse to read things on face value. That's the first thing. Secondly, you have to go beyond your usual sources, you know, reading materials that have been written from Western perspectives gives you an entry point into these debates and all of that. But try and read some of the more critical African scholars. This requires excavation. It requires you to take time to understand where this material is and all of that, because it might not be in the easy places. The problem with academic scholarship is that we always go to the same sources. And so we replicate, reproduce, and so we repeat the same stuff. And because it's been repeated a million times, and it becomes the single source of truth. And I would like us to start breaking this mode of knowledge production. We need to hear what the Africans themselves are saying. What are they writing? And this requires more patience. It requires more innovation than normal research. And so that would be my advice.